All right, it's time to start. We are so pleased today to have Dr. Andrew Eros with us today, and he's going to talk about California's water priorities that relates to groundwater. Andrew is an environmental and natural resource economist focused on questions related to design, development, and effectiveness of legal and economic institutions for managing the environment. His work often involves applied economic modeling and econometric analysis, and he previously worked in Germany and in the United States on projects to inform policy making on so many topics, including climate change, energy, and water pricing, river restoration, and so on. He holds a PhD in economics and environmental science from University of California, Santa Barbara, and a bachelor's in economics from Pomona College. Welcome, Andrew. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Mady, for the nice introduction. Well, if it's time to get started, I'll go ahead and share my slides. And we're going to have a nice conversation today on sort of one overarching topic and then one more specific topic, derivative of that. The first is California's water priorities. This is going to deliver a little bit of information from a report that we released in November of last year, and that we actually in the PPIC Water Policy Center release every single year. And from that, we're going to identify groundwater management as one of California's top water priorities and dig a little bit deeper on that, thinking about how the state can transition to better groundwater management and what role markets for water are going to play in that transition. So briefly here, just in the beginning, thanks again for the nice introduction, Mady. I'm a research fellow in the Water Policy Center at PPIC. The PPIC Water Policy Center covers topics ranging from what you would imagine from the name, really targeted work on water policy in the state of California, but also ranging into other topics such as land use issues and air quality as well. But today's focus is going to be first on priorities for California's water, focusing on key current stressors and key focus areas moving forward. And derivative of that, we're going to talk about trading of water, groundwater, and climate adaptation more broadly, focusing on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014 and how key points for reform and improvement in both surface and groundwater markets can help support implementation of that piece of legislation. So the first thing to mention is that, as I said a moment ago, priorities from California's water that we're going to talk about today are all laid out in a report that we wrote back in November of 2021. You can see the list of authors there includes just about everybody in the Water Policy Center. And in this report, we identify trends that have been going on for about the last 12 months in California's water management and policy scene. Areas for focus, both for local managers, regional managers, and policymakers, and key barriers towards improving the situation. For the most part, this report is based on structured stakeholder interviews, but importantly, it builds on a lot of other Water Policy Center work, so other reports, blog posts, fact sheets that we're writing about more specific topics. So in last year's priorities, we identified some changing trends that we labeled shifting currents, and then accordingly derived some priorities for action from there. So really the big story is that the 2021 priorities highlight climatic changes that are not new. They've been going on for quite some time, but really they reared their head quite notably in the 2020-2021 timeframe. The first of these is increasing drought intensity and duration. So a lot of times when thinking about water in the West more broadly, and in California in particular, we talk about wetter wets and drier dries. We've been experiencing one of the drier dries recently. There was a lot of excitement even just this last winter in December as we received quite a bit of precipitation that perhaps our last December might have been a drought buster. We would have gotten out of the last 2.5 or so years of drought that we've been experiencing, but alas, it was not. January and February and March here have failed to deliver a lot of precipitation. So we find ourselves for the most part in a continuation of what is another now 2.5-year drought, more or less. That's really emblematic of increasing drought intensity and severity in California. When we're going to have wetter wets and drier dries moving forward, an ongoing current or need is to update infrastructure to deal with those wetter wets and drier dries. On the one hand, that means being ready for large floods when they come along, not only to protect human health and property, but also to be able to capture that water and put it to use in the drier times. Currently, the state of California doesn't have all of the infrastructure that you might imagine it would need to deal with this sort of looming, these sorts of looming climatic changes. But what's really important is we're not just talking about physical infrastructure here, we're also talking about institutional infrastructure, such as new rules to manage groundwater. This is going to be a theme that I'll talk about for the next half an hour or so, but it is part of the shifting current started in 2014 with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Finally, we would have been remiss after the past couple of years not to have identified headwater forest vulnerability as an important sort of impact of the changing climate. I'm sure all of us who are living in California, or again, more broadly out in the West, have noticed the increasing frequency and severity of wildfires that has been essentially trending for the past several years, if not longer. This is a problem by itself, but really also ties in with water priorities insofar as the health of headwater forests up in our upper watersheds really impacts both risk for increasing flood damage after a fire. Floods tend to be worse, but also impacts our reliability of water supply. So headwater forest vulnerability is another shifting trend to keep an eye on. And finally, securing reliable funding sources. So this is a trend that essentially could show up in many of our priorities reports. There's a lot of idiosyncrasy in how much funding is available for solving some of these problems moving forward. But one thing we highlighted is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, the state actually has kind of a flush budget right now, and this represents an opportunity to secure funding to tackle some of the priorities that we lay out in the rest of the report. So, derivative of these trends, some priorities that we identified are ensuring safe and affordable drinking water. In many ways, this is a bit of a holdover from some of our recommendations during the pandemic, which really revealed that when Californians face a lot of economic stresses, it can be difficult even to meet basic payments for things like water service in their homes. So, especially thinking about what are our opportunities that are available to us with state funding and increasingly potentially new programs for federal funding to help support low income rate assistance programs for drinking water. This was a priority we highlighted. And then another priority was in the face of a changing climate, we really need to rethink the way that we approach ecosystem restoration and not just focus on singular species that may be identified as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act or the California Endangered Species Act, but really think more about managing for species, especially aquatic species, at the watershed scale. And this includes expanding headwater forest management efforts, not just to produce better outcomes on the wildfire side, but also to think more holistically and think ahead about what headwater forest health means for flood preparedness and the reliability of water supply. But the one priority that we identified in this brief that I really want to focus on today is hastening the shift to groundwater sustainability. So in the past, in California, groundwater has been more or less open access in many areas of the state. This has led to long-term declines in groundwater tables in aquifers throughout the state, and ultimately groundwater availability as a result. And really stabilizing our groundwater aquifers is going to play a big role in helping to adapt to some of these climatic changes that we identified as the meaningful stressors or shifting currents up above. The ability to use groundwater basins to store water from wet times and then extract it again in dry times is going to play a key role in climate adaptation and really statewide resilience moving forward. So with that, I'm going to launch into a discussion more focused on groundwater, and specifically more focused on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, and what role markets for both surface water and potentially also groundwater can play in supporting implementation of that act. This is one of the priorities we identified in the priorities brief, not just we need to get our groundwater in order, but we really need to follow through on implementation of this act that was signed into law in 2014 in order to make sure that local groundwater users have the tools that they need to manage their basins sustainably. Before I say too much more, I'll go ahead and give a short plug for another report that we released slightly ahead of the priorities brief last year. This report is called Improving California's Water Market, How Water Trading and Banking Can Support Groundwater Management, and it really sums up a lot of the ideas that I'm about to present over the next 20 minutes or so on how SGMA implementation can be supported by markets. So in this report, we present the results of a lot of novel data gathering and analysis on things like surface water availability for farms and other water agencies throughout California's Central Valley, new data gathering and analysis on water trading throughout the state, and other sorts of analyses. And in addition to that, the recommendations and takeaways from this report were supported with numerous structured stakeholder interviews and reviews from water users and agencies throughout the state. So before we talk about trading water, we really need to do a little one-slide primer on California water rights law, which is ambitious as always, but it'll help provide a little bit of a foundation for people to understand what we're talking about. So when we trade water in California, what is it that we're trading? When it comes to surface water rights, California has a hybrid rights system. So individuals or water districts can hold private rights to divert and use surface water in California under two main systems. The first is the riparian system, essentially stating that if you own land that abuts a water course like a river or a lake, you have a claim to take water out of that source. And the second is prior appropriation. So even if you're not adjacent to a water course, you can still establish a claim via diversion of that water and its use on your lands. And those claims are established by first in time, first in right. Importantly, both of those types of rights are subject to reasonable and beneficial use requirements, essentially to make sure that people aren't wasting water. What's important here is that under either of those doctrines, private users, farmers, municipal drinking water suppliers, et cetera, could establish rights that entitle them to take water and put it to use every year. And these rights are treated like real property and can be traded amongst different water users. In addition to these private rights, many water users also hold contract entitlements with major water projects throughout the state. So when I talk about water projects here, I mean things like the State Water Project or the Central Valley Project, which are large infrastructure projects managed by the state and federal governments, respectively here, to both divert, store, and then distribute water throughout the state. So we do a pretty good job in California of plumbing the state so that we can take water from where it's plentiful, especially up north, to where it's less plentiful down in the south, thinking about places like Los Angeles, Riverside, and other areas down there. And on these big government-run projects, different water users will have entitlements to receive water. Similar to private rights, these entitlements can be traded, although oftentimes with some limitations. So when we talk about trading water, that's what we're talking about. Now, against that background, here comes in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Like I mentioned before, prior to this, in most areas, so excepting most of those outlined in green on the map on the left, you could pump basically as much water as you wanted out of the groundwater aquifer and put it to use on your own lands for reasonable and beneficial uses. This led to big problems, especially in areas highlighted as red on this map, where over the long term, more water was being extracted from the groundwater aquifer than was replenishing it annually. So groundwater tables were declining pretty precipitously. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014 applies to users in critically overdrafted high and medium priority basins. And what it means is that they're going to have to work together to form groundwater sustainability agencies that draft plans to essentially change how groundwater gets used in their basins in order to avoid undesirable results that are significant and unreasonable. In practice, that's the language from, that's the language from the legislation. In practice, this means they're going to have to balance inflows into their basins with outflows in their basins, either by increasing recharge or ultimately, most likely in many cases, reducing the amount of pumping that's going on and ultimately reducing the amount of water that's being used. So where are we in implementation of this act? Agency formation is complete. Groundwater sustainability agencies exist in all of the basins that are subject to SGMA. The first round of plans for how they plan to achieve sustainability have been submitted in 2020 and 2022. So review of those plans is ongoing, and those plans will have quite a long time horizon, with full implementation and sustainability not expected to be achieved by 2040 or 2042. So while that means we don't have to achieve sustainability now, it still means there's a lot of work to be done over the next 20 years or so to ensure that we achieve sustainability. I like to zoom in. You'll see on this map here on the left, a lot of the red basins happen to be in the San Joaquin Valley, the southern half of California's Central Valley, and basically it's a big part of its agricultural powerhouse. And I'd like to just zoom in on the San Joaquin for a second and really highlight what SGMA means for this region of the state, both in terms of potential benefits and potential costs. So historically in this region, like in many others, the price of groundwater has been essentially zero. It would cost water users some amount of money to actually pump the water to the surface. It requires a lot of energy to do so, but the cost of the resource itself, they didn't have to pay for. This is the source of sort of this long-term persistent overdraft. And indeed, this region was highly reliant on groundwater as a drought buffer. During a drought, when surface water isn't coming into the region, it basically shifted to groundwater to make up the difference. So on the right, you'll see some estimates based on the groundwater sustainability plans for the region of how much overdraft was being accumulated annually in each of the subbasins within this region. So on the left-hand side, those are the estimates from the plans, which use variable years, but on the right-hand side, you'll see our recalculations using a common set of years. All told, the plans do acknowledge overdraft within their basins, and they acknowledge valley-wide about 1.7 million acre-feet annually of overdraft. This is a pretty substantial number. It exceeds about 10% of the total applied water use in the valley on an annual basis. So addressing this overdraft, especially in places like Kern, Kings basins, to some extent in Tule and Madera basins there along the east side of the valley, this will mean big changes in how groundwater gets used, and ultimately, given limited opportunities for recharge, increase the recharge side or the inflow side of the equation, this will mean a lot of reduction in pumping and a lot of reduction in irrigated agricultural acreages. So really, PPIC estimates about or exceeding 500,000 acres of currently irrigated agricultural land will come out of production within the San Joaquin Valley in order to balance the groundwater basin. Again, this is somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total irrigated acreage in the valley today. So these changes in groundwater management don't just mean, shutting off wells for individual well owners potentially, or encouraging them to use less water. This is going to have real meaningful and lasting economic implications for the valley as a whole. And one thing I'd like to highlight here is that Sigma is going to deliver big benefits, both statewide and to the valley. 20, 30, 40 years from now, these regions are going to have much more reliable groundwater access as a result of balancing their basins. But in the short term, as people are cutting back on groundwater, taking agricultural land out of production, this can have real short-term costs, not only individually for landowners, but also collectively within these regions in terms of the amount of revenue that county governments are taking in to provide services like schools and fire and police, things of that nature. So there are real short-term costs here, and if we want to think seriously about how to best implement Sigma, we need to think about how to minimize those costs while still achieving our goals. That's where the discussion of markets comes in when we talk about Sigma. So why have a market? Put simply, trading surface water, and I'll get to groundwater in a minute here, can help reduce the costs of meeting groundwater sustainability targets. At its root, better managing these resources that are likely to become more scarce as we start pumping less groundwater will reduce revenue losses by shifting water from lower value crops to higher value crops as we collectively reduce our total water use. It'll help reduce job losses, and it'll help reduce, to some extent, land fallowing. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see the results from some analysis that we did in 2019 here at the Water Policy Center, investigating how trading surface water could help reduce the costs of implementing Sigma in the San Joaquin Valley. So you'll see under different assumptions about over what scales and people could trade water within the valley. The reduction in, for example, farm-related GDP losses basically is threefold. So running from about $3 billion of farm-related GDP down to, 1.25 or about 1, depending on what the scenarios are. In short, maximizing these returns to resource use can help reduce the cost of implementing Sigma and ultimately promote effective and earlier adoption of the kinds of groundwater management, groundwater restrictions that are going to be really valuable for limiting groundwater use and bringing basins into balance. California's surface water market has grown over time. So when we talk about, again, surface water, the trading of surface water, this isn't new, but its importance is going to be highlighted as we reduce our reliance on groundwater moving forward. The one thing I'd like to really highlight from this graph, which is put together with PPIC's sort of long-term data set on surface water trades in the state of California, is just the shift from short-term trades, which made up the bulk of trades throughout the early 90s, mid 90s, and even into the 2000s, to long-term trades. So these are multi-year agreements where instead of saying, hey, it's a drought this year, go talk to my neighbor and see if I can acquire some water from my neighboring water district. Now these are multi-year deals where it's upfront. We might agree to a 5 or a 10-year deal where I'm receiving water from you in exchange for compensation either every year or under certain conditions, and also permanent trades to some extent. But really the shift has been from short-term individual year trades to longer-term multi-year deals, and to a large extent, this is reflective of the need of water users to really economize on all of the costs that they have to bear to get a trade done. It's not necessarily easy to trade water in California, and that really is one of the focus of our report here, is how to make this easier. So when we talk about trading surface water, there are ongoing challenges that exist and that could threaten the ability of surface water trading to really reduce the costs of Sigma implementation. The first is conveyance. You have to be able to move water from the seller to the buyer. The second is administrative barriers. So there are various administrative barriers, especially when trading CVP and so Central Valley Project or State Water Project water that arise. These administrative barriers have real value insofar as this is a review of water transfers to make sure that they don't have unintended consequences for third parties who are not the seller or the buyer. But this administrative review can be, in many cases, cumbersome, and effectively, if it takes too long, it can obviate the need for a transfer. If you want to get a transfer done in a 3-month window, but the review takes 4 months, then it can be the case that your transfers are no longer useful at the end of that time frame. There are also local economic implications of transfers that oftentimes elicit opposition. So when a seller trades water to a buyer in the seller's region, oftentimes that means lands aren't being irrigated anymore. There aren't people being employed to work the lands. The land isn't producing revenue, both privately as well as for local governments. So oftentimes it can be difficult to get transfers approved at the irrigation district level because people don't want to see water leave the region. And then finally, despite the sort of long history of surface water rights that I described a few slides ago, there is still uncertain title to surface water in some places and under certain conditions in California. In essence, if you can't justify or if you can't document how much water you've been using on a regular basis, then it is a potential outcome of a transfer that during review, your water rights will be revised downwards. This provides a disincentive to trade because folks believe that their rights could either be expropriated or extinguished. And more importantly, this produces a lot of uncertainty on the buyer's side. They won't know exactly what they're getting if they are not sure about the reliability of the underlying water right. So these are all ongoing challenges that we provide some recommendations for in the report. But before we get there, I want to kind of shift gears. And instead of talking about surface water and how trading surface water can help support groundwater management, let's talk about trading groundwater. So groundwater markets are actually rather rare, both in California as well as more broadly throughout the West. As I mentioned before, up until 2014, in most areas in California, if you owned land over an aquifer, you could drill a well more or less as deep as you want and pump more or less as much water as you want, so long as you can put it to use on your own lands. Under those conditions, there isn't much opportunity for a market because nobody has volumetric entitlements that they might want to trade with one another. In the context of SGMA, despite sort of limited emphasis on demand management in the initial plans, there are widespread expectations of cutbacks, and that markets for groundwater can help reduce the costs, much in the same way we documented surface water trading can help reduce costs. Groundwater markets that move water from low value applications to higher value applications as we shrink the pie can really help reduce the overall costs. Under SGMA, there are emerging markets in Kern County and the San Joaquin Valley. Madera also has a pilot program getting up and running for trading water. And these are sort of initial efforts under SGMA. But one thing that's important to remember is that despite their rarity up until now, there are examples of groundwater markets, even within the state of California, going back as many as 20 or more years ago. And one of those examples is from the Mojave Desert, sort of just north, actually, of Riverside across the San Bernardino Mountains out in the desert. And this groundwater market has been around since the 90s and receives, in our report, a very sort of in-depth look in one of the technical appendices. And in that appendix, we lay out basic information about the market, how it was formed, how it operates, and importantly, how it can serve as a model for other groundwater users elsewhere in the state who are thinking about setting up markets to help them implement SGMA. So starting from basics, the Mojave Desert is the driest desert in North America, but it experienced persistent overdraft from the 1940s onward, especially as more effective technologies for pumping groundwater became prevalent in the region. The ability to pump groundwater out of the desert and irrigate predominantly alfalfa out there, so alfalfa hay, both for feed and export, This turned into a big, that became very popular, and this turned into a big problem for the local groundwater. This overdraft actually continued from the 1940s all the way through to the 80s, at which point the users in the area decided to set up a right system for themselves that would cap the total amount of pumping and then annually ramp down everybody's pumping quite quickly to establish a balance between inflows and outflows, essentially the same kind of requirements that are going to be required under SGMA, and stabilize the groundwater table as a result. This new right system broke the aquifer up into 5 different sub-areas, and across these sub-areas, trading isn't allowed, but it is allowed within the sub-areas. Who's trading in the Mojave? Agricultural users who, throughout much of the region's history, were growing alfalfa, have been trading water to one another in areas where the ramp down has proceeded and groundwater sustainability is achieved. To a large extent, alfalfa is no longer grown. Price of water is too high to justify growing alfalfa. They've switched over to things like pistachios. And also urban and environmental water users are also active in the market. Urban users acquiring water predominantly from low-value agriculture to help support growing urban areas like Victorville and Hesperia, and environmental users who want to use groundwater pumping entitlements to do things like irrigate riparian vegetation and provide habitat, especially for bird species out in the Mojave. So again, if you want more information about the Mojave example, that's available in the report in technical appendix. But really one of the big key takeaways here from the Mojave experience is that the market provided a really important sort of linchpin for moving this groundwater system from a state of persistent overdraft for many decades into a more sustainable situation. And how did it do that? Not only did it reduce the overall sort of economic cost for the region of reducing this groundwater use pretty substantially, but moreover, it provided an opportunity for landowners who were pumping water and facing huge cutbacks to actually benefit from the transition, because they received tradable pumping rights that after the market emerged were actually quite valuable assets that they were able to capitalize on. Beyond just trading groundwater to reduce costs within a given year, or as we ramp down pumping rights moving forward, groundwater banking is also going to be an important part of helping sort of facilitate SGMA implementation moving forward. When we talk about groundwater banking here, we mean taking actually not groundwater, but surface water from the wetter wet periods, so from wet years and potentially above average precipitation years, storing it in groundwater aquifers, and then extracting it later during times of drought. This is really important because it's going to help sort of enlarge the groundwater pie, especially in drought years when people are really reliant on groundwater and their surface water entitlements are not delivering water for them. But what's really important is that there's a synergy between the kind of institutions that you need, so volumetric rights for pumping, you need for groundwater markets, and what you need for groundwater banking. Under the previous system, where anybody could pump as much water as they want for the aquifer, any surface water that you recharge the aquifer, you may not have a claim to it later. You could recharge surface water into the groundwater and somebody else could pump it, and then you're just sort of out of luck. But once a new institutional system has been set up for to protect that water, essentially to credit you when you recharge groundwater so you can extract it later, that really facilitates groundwater banking. Although those conditions aren't present in many basins throughout California today, nonetheless, in San Joaquin, groundwater banking has been a staple in certain areas. So the Kern Water Bank and Semi-Tropic Water Storage District in Kern County have made up more than 50% of deposits and withdrawal in existing groundwater banks up until today. There are some groundwater banks in Southern California as well, but as you can see from this graph here, these Kern County water banks make up the vast majority of banked water. And the amount of banked water follows more or less what you might expect in this time series here, dry years being outlined with gray backgrounds. The amount of banked water ramps up during wet times as people have additional surface water supplies they'd like to store, and then really drops precipitously during drought as they extract that stored water to make up for the fact that during drought they're not receiving their normal surface water entitlements. So we're seeing quite a bit of water being banked in these two particular water banks in Kern County over the past, couple decades. But as we think about even just in the San Joaquin Valley, addressing 1.7 million acre feet of annual overdraft moving forward over the next 2 decades, the scope and scale of groundwater banking that's going to be required to do that is going to expand quite significantly. And it's going to require institutional innovation to help essentially close down access to those groundwater basins and make sure that when folks recharge, they then later have the ability, both institutionally and practically, physically, to access the water that they've stored in the groundwater basins. So we've talked about SGMA. We've laid out how markets can help both on the surface water side and on the groundwater side, but there are barriers to really implementing these sorts of market mechanisms, and it's time to talk about opportunities for reform that can help facilitate better groundwater management. So one thing we identified in this report were 5 different enabling conditions for markets generally when it comes to water. The first is secure tradable rights. As I mentioned before, if it's not clear what you're trading, or if trading parties don't have faith in the reliability of the underlying water right, then it will be difficult to transfer them. You need reliable measurement and reporting systems to make sure not only that people know what they're trading, but also to make sure that folks aren't taking water that doesn't belong to them. You're going to need a hydrologic connection between trading parties. Again, in the surface water context, this means conveyance to get water from the seller to the buyer. You're also going to need transparent market information, not just about who has what to trade, but also about resource conditions and how much water there might be available for trade in the market overall. And finally, importantly, you're going to need mechanisms for addressing third-party impacts. So if I trade surface water from one location to another, as we discussed before, that might entail certain impacts on local communities who might no longer have groundwater recharge from that surface water use, or if you're moving groundwater pumping effort within a groundwater basin, the new person who's pumping more, their well might have impacts on neighboring wells, etc. So you need to have some sort of mechanism for addressing these impacts while still facilitating trade. So we've broken down our assessment in the report basically into 3 categories: surface water trading, groundwater trading, and underground banking. When it comes to surface water, we've got the foundations in California that we need. We have reasonably secure tradable rights for groundwater, for surface water under both the prior appropriation doctrine for irrigation districts and private individuals to trade their prior appropriation water rights. And we also have opportunities for folks to trade CVP and state water project contract entitlements. We have reasonably robust, reliable measurement and reporting systems, although there's certainly plenty of room for improvement there. And where we really need work is in creating more hydrologic connection between users. So oftentimes it's difficult to, despite the fact that we move water from the wet north down to places like Riverside, Mojave, Los Angeles, et cetera, with the State Water Project, nonetheless, more locally, there is a need for expanded infrastructure to move water from potential sellers to potential buyers. Additionally, we need work on transparent market information and, importantly, mechanisms for addressing third-party impacts. As I mentioned earlier, administrative review can be cumbersome. There's already well-established water law and policy precedents for ensuring that there is little or no harm to third parties from surface water trading in California. What we really need to work on now is making that administrative review more streamlined and quicker so that we can move water more flexibly during times when it's really important to get it from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity. On the flip side, when we're talking about groundwater trading, outside of limited examples such as the Mojave, for the most part, we don't even have the foundational components set up to enable groundwater trading. So I'm thinking about capped volumetric entitlements that would say, the varying parties within a basin can pump this amount of water in any given year, and if they want to trade that, they could trade these volumes. That doesn't exist in most basins up until now, but this is something that Sigma enables, promotes, and in some cases really is going to require in order to get users to agree on a path forward for reducing their groundwater use consistently with sustainable yield within their basins. This touches not only just on the definition of those rights, who gets to pump how much, but also on reliable measurement and reporting systems. Up until Sigma was passed, really many basins that were in persistent states of overdraft didn't have really good monitoring systems to understand who was pumping how much and really what the groundwater conditions looked like. The one bright spot in thinking about groundwater trading right now is just that you're essentially, for the most part, guaranteed hydrologic connection, because if I stop pumping in one area of a groundwater basin, we're all pumping from a shared resource, and accordingly somebody else can start pumping somewhere else, and the hydrologic connection exists, but just by virtue of it being a shared basin. And finally, thinking about underground banking of surface water in groundwater aquifers, we have kind of a mixed bag. On the surface water side, generally people have well-defined entitlements to the water that they would be recharging. But again, as Sigma moves forward, we're going to have to make progress on defining rights to pump from groundwater aquifers such that any water that gets recharged would then be available for recharging parties later on. And again, both in the groundwater trading and the underground banking context, mechanisms for addressing third-party impacts are, with the exception of places like the Mojave, still in their infancy, but something that Sigma not only supports, but requires for successful implementation. So I really want to drill in for another minute or two on this question of addressing third-party impacts without stifling trading. As I'd mentioned before, both in the surface water context and in the groundwater context, changes in water use can affect other parties. So again, in the groundwater context, if I were to trade my pumping entitlement to Mady or somebody else, and he were to start pumping more, that could potentially have an impact on other neighboring water users because he's going to be drawing a lot more groundwater out of the aquifer in his location. For surface water, multiple approvals, both if you're trading contract entitlements at either the state or federal project administrator level and at the state level, oftentimes when it comes to just moving the underlying water rights around, these approvals seek to avoid harm, but oftentimes they can be so cumbersome and take so long that they basically obviate trades that otherwise would be beneficial and could move forward. In the groundwater context, Sigma establishes these new protections. The plans, while balancing inflows and outflows from the basin, must also avoid or mitigate any of the significant undesirable effects of groundwater use. And so this means in the context of a market, this is not a new requirement that exists only when you have a market, but it's a requirement more broadly for groundwater management under Sigma that has implications for how markets will function. There's been a lot of discussion as Sigma implementation has proceeded over the past few years about what this means for well-dependent communities. So especially in the San Joaquin Valley, there are many small rural communities or individual water well owners who are using water for domestic purposes, who have seen their wells go dry during periods of drought. And there's a concern that as we ramp down total groundwater use, but also enable a market, that trading could potentially have negative impacts on these same communities who are seeing their groundwater wells dry up during drought. And one of the points that we make in the report here is that the most important step that we can take to help provide protection for these wells really boils down to addressing the negative impacts of overdraft rather than trading. These wells have been going dry over the past, in some cases, several decades, mostly because we've allowed groundwater tables to persistently and continually fall both over the long term and especially during drought. So insofar as trading is going to be a tool to help bring parties to the table and get SGMA implemented and essentially over the long term stabilize those water tables, trading is going to play a big role in protecting well-dependent communities. It is also the case that it's possible that trading could shift the spatial distribution of pumping and potentially impact these well-dependent communities as well. But the first order impact here is really about addressing overdraft rather than the potential impacts of trading, although both are worth keeping an eye on moving forward. Writ large, what we're seeing is that done right, trading both of surface water, but in the future as well as of groundwater, can really help small communities insofar as it helps to facilitate SGMA implementation and stabilize water tables. And the same goes for small growers as well, who might have certain trepidations about engaging in a water market where, compared to just a free pumping allowance they received before, now there would be marketable entitlements. If they receive an allocation up front, just like everybody else in the water market, then they should really stand to benefit both by buying water when they need it, as well as having the opportunity to capitalize and lease water when conditions warranted. So what will it take to realize the market's potential? We have a couple of recommendations in the report that I'll go through quickly. In fact, in the report, we have a set of 24 different recommendations, but I'll spare you the details today and just highlight some of the big overarching messages. The first is that we really need to lay the groundwork for groundwater markets in SGMA basins that haven't adopted them today. This is going to mean that GSAs, those groundwater sustainabilities that were formed by local users, are going to have to establish allocations. This is the first step, not just towards having a groundwater market, but really, in many cases, towards implementing SGMA at all. And it is a very difficult step. Transitioning from everybody getting to pump what they want to you have a certain amount that you get to pump and you don't get to pump more unless you trade for it is a big step. This is really where the decisions about who pays how much in terms of foregone pumping are going to be made. And this is going to be a really difficult task for GSAs to manage. While they're doing that, they're also going to have to come up with systems for addressing third-party impacts that provide real protections for third parties while also facilitating trade of groundwater within their basins. In the report, we go into a little bit more detail about how they can do this well, but these are really priorities for local management going forward. Navigating trade-offs in market design, now zooming out a little bit, thinking not just about local groundwater markets, but also how to make surface water markets function better. State and federal agencies are going to need to do work to think about how they can streamline their approval strategies or their approval processes for Central Valley Project water, State Water Project water, and especially in this case of the state, the transaction of private diversion rights. Thinking a little bit, again, broader than just surface water here, also, how does the state or local, how do local and state governmental bodies think about addressing the local and regional impacts of land fouling that will likely result from transfers? This is something that's been sort of a thorn in the side for water markets for decades in California, which is that when you move water out of a selling region, oftentimes that means, again, land isn't being irrigated, folks aren't being paid to work it, counties aren't getting as much revenue from land, property taxes, et cetera. What does a sustainable path look like moving forward for areas that ultimately are going to be selling water? This is a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but ultimately local and state government agencies are going to have to work together to think about what can be done in terms of regional economic development to facilitate resilient economic conditions in areas that are selling water. And there are some additional considerations that we get into in the report, like how to make smart infrastructure investments to enable trade, and how to really set up the tools that local agencies are going to need to enable groundwater banking programs. So with that, I'll wrap up. just by highlighting that California's water priorities shift from year to year. If you want to keep up to date with them, you can look for the priorities brief coming out of the Water Policy Center every year. This past year, we really highlighted the increasingly unpredictable weather and climate as driving forces today. But common themes from year to year really involve reliable funding to fill gaps where actions are needed, but there might be a need for more funding to help coordinate folks, and flexible management strategies like markets that enable folks either using surface water or groundwater to move that water around more flexibly moving forward. And focusing in a little bit more specifically on groundwater sustainability, Sigma is really transformational, both in terms of benefits. Many years from now, having healthy groundwater basins is going to pay real dividends, but also, especially as climate change increasingly provides us with wetter wets and drier dries, but also it means big upfront costs for some folks today. Market tools can help soften this transition, but there is work needed to help improve conditions for those markets and establish the new institutions they need to function well. So I'm gonna stop there and say thank you and turn it back over to Mady for maybe some questions and discussion.
Yeah, that was a great discussion and a lot of good information. And the report is available on your website, right? PPRC's website. We share the link later with the folks. So let's see the questions. Okay, I see one that says with the development of these water banks and trading water, do you think there will be, or we will see conflicts over water and it becomes more scarce source?
Yeah, so I think in many ways over the past several decades, we have been seeing these conflicts, especially when it comes to groundwater. Under the pre-existing conditions where anybody is able to take as much water as they want from out of a groundwater aquifer, in many ways that creates a race to extract the water today, because if I don't extract the water today, somebody else will have extracted it by tomorrow. This is the kind of thing, these are the kinds of conditions that oftentimes breed conflict. And so these conflicts have arisen in the past and ultimately led to the kinds of court adjudications. So I didn't use that word today, but that's how the Mojave water rights trading system came about, was because some users ultimately decided that this method, sort of a free-for-all, from sharing water within their basin was not working. It created conflict between the users that they had to resolve through a court process. Now, one of the benefits of going through that court process, or now under Sigma, potentially just a GSA process, to establish allocations and create a market, is that the establishment of the allocations really clears the air as to who has entitlements to use how much water, and ultimately, once those allocations are made, can help to reduce conflict because users won't be racing to extract the resource. And in the future, disagreements or competing interests for where and how the water should be used can be resolved through the market in a way that is involves less conflict. So overall, I'm optimistic that if we establish these new institutions, we'll see actually less conflict over water resources.
Thanks, Andrew. There's another question. It says, as an average citizen, in order to help with the water crisis right now, what we can do?
It's a great question. So I think one thing that the average citizen can do is just keep an eye on what water availability or water scarcity conditions are like in your area. Oftentimes, municipal water utilities, so the folks who make sure that when you turn the tap, water comes out, oftentimes those utilities will be publishing information about what sort of drought stage they're in. Oftentimes they'll also be adopting sort of regulations on who can use how much water, but just keeping an eye through them or through other sources on what your drought condition is and adjusting your your own water use behavior accordingly can be really valuable. The second thing that the average citizen can do here is basically support not necessarily sort of like individual ballot measures or anything like that, but keep an eye on what kinds of ballot measures are coming out in terms of supporting funding, reliable funding for water projects, whether that's physical infrastructure investments or planning grants to help move Sigma forward or what have you. A lot of funding for water system maintenance and operations comes from the local level, but important gaps get filled by state and federal funding initiatives, and oftentimes those only pass as ballot measures. And so keeping an eye on those ballot measures and really deliberating over whether you as a private citizen think it's a good use of taxpayer money and voting accordingly can really help to sort of shore up some of these problems.
Great, Andrew. We have time for this last question. I think it's a good one. It says you mentioned that that's about third parties and unintended effects. Do you have any personal experience with areas that have been negatively affected by the way groundwater is distributed and how people go about making sure smaller communities are not underserved as a result of having water to go to bigger communities or industries?
Okay, so I think as I understand it, the question is about third-party impacts and right. Sort of unintended effects. When it comes to groundwater in particular, I can't think of a really good example off of the top of my head about third-party impacts in that context. Well, so okay, here's one. In the Mojave, they actually set up their system at the beginning when they set up their new groundwater rights system and the trading system. They broke it into those sub areas that I showed in the map in order to help address upfront potential third-party impacts. So across those sub areas, there would be a risk, let's say, that if in one of those sub areas, the upstream one, that if we were to buy too many pumping entitlements from elsewhere in the basin and just pump them all in that area, that would reduce flows to the rest of the groundwater basin, and ultimately means that those people downstream of us might end up in a state of overdraft again. So they set up barriers on trading to make sure that not all of the pumping rights ended up in the upstream area. So that's an example of sort of proactive market design that can help address some of those issues. And if you're interested in more details about that specific case, I would definitely suggest looking at the technical appendix of the Water Markets report that focuses on the Mojave. It goes into a little bit more detail about that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was a great pleasure to listen to you and to learn more about groundwater markets and Sigma. I appreciate that, and thanks everyone for participating here. There will be a link available if you want to watch later, and the recording. I will send it to you, Andrew, as well. And I'll send around the link to the report and also to PPIC Water Center. So yeah, you guys doing a great job. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And if there are other questions that we weren't able to get to today, feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the PPIC website.
Perfect. And you have your information on the last slide as well, or
yeah, exactly. So I can show that real quick. Yeah, so errors@ppic.org. So feel free to reach out. And yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.